So we've come to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus in the gospel according to St. Matthew. And this whole situation is actually far more exciting than I think any of us really realize, because we don't have the context of understanding what it was like as a first century Jew to be experiencing this for the first time, to be seeing the kind of ministry that Jesus was doing. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a history lesson because I think this is so crucial to understanding our roots and understanding the purpose of the church, of what Jesus did. So first of all, you had the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So God had established these tribes, and then eventually they came together in a kingdom, the kingdom of David. And to the kingdom of David, God made a promise that the kingdom of David would have no end, that it would last forever. So this is quite a promise that God makes, that they would continue to reign in this kingdom, that by the line of David, this would carry on. And so what do we see next? We see King Solomon, his son, and that kingdom is an era of peace, and it's a wonderful time. Right after that, everything goes to pot. Everything falls apart. So we had the 10 tribes of Israel went to the north, and they were living in the northern area. And then you had 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, which lived to the south. They started warring against each other. The kingdom itself was divided against itself. And so there was a lot of this infighting that was happening among the Israelites. Well, then what happens is the Assyrians show up. And they come into the north where those 10 tribes were residing, and they conquer it. And they start sending out, all the people are dispersed, they're scattered abroad, they end up intermarrying with the Assyrians and all those other people. And so there is this kind of a loss of 10 of the tribes of Israel, the vast majority. Well, okay, so we have Judah and Benjamin. They seem to be okay. Except for what happens? In come the Babylonians. Now we have the Babylonian exile where those tribes were sent out and they became dispersed as well among the Babylonians. And the only difference is that eventually the king allowed them to return back to their land. He even gave them money so that they could rebuild their temple. And so you had the nation of Judea, what we call Judea, that whole area remained. Okay, so they're still there, but the kingdom looks to be in shambles, right? God makes this promise, this kingdom will last forever, and only a few centuries later, it's just done. You know, it's amazing that there's anything left. And this to a degree also remains today, because if you ever ask anyone, about the land of Israel, we call people Jews, right? From Judea, right? So from the tribe of Judah. So we call those people Jews, but do we call anyone like Danites or, any of the other tribes of Israel? Did you ever hear any other names? We always refer to them as the Jews because they're the only ones that remained to know their lineage, to know where they came from. So this is the whole situation in which Jesus enters into the scene. Now there's even more to it, because where the conquering began was in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. So these were the regions that were first conquered by the Assyrians, and it was from there that everything started to fall apart. The kingdom began to erode and be spread abroad. So Jesus comes in, and what does he do? He goes to the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, it says. Why? St. Matthew says, in order to fulfill the prophecy that was spoken. And that was our first reading today, but I'm going to read it again. They quote the prophet Isaiah. So now hear this. Imagine, you're a people who have been dispersed. You're a people who have lost your identity. You're a people who feel like the promise of God has fallen apart and that there is no hope. And now you hear these words from Isaiah, land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, the beginning where everything started to fall apart. On the road by the sea across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who sat in the region of the shadow of death, light has dawned. Okay, so this is why this is such an amazing hope for the people. They're longing for this freedom, longing for the fact that God is going to restore them once again. What has become a Gentile nation, a pagan nation, from there, starting from there, we're going to see God restoring the kingdom. So what happens? Jesus comes in, goes to Zebulun and Naphtali, starts preaching about the kingdom of heaven, and then he gathers around himself, we start to see, he gathers around Peter and Andrew and James and John, and he's beginning to gather the 12 apostles. You starting to see what Jesus is doing here? You know, the people did. Here he's restoring the 12 tribes of Israel. And that he says he is setting the apostles to stand over, to reign over those 12 tribes. And that he's proclaiming about the kingdom of heaven has come near. And then he's performing miracles. People are being healed. People are coming to see again, to hear again, to speak again. People are literally coming back to life. This is what people are witnessing, all beginning in the place where everything first started to fall apart. Now it's being restored, and they're seeing visible, tangible signs. Now you can imagine why they were so excited, why this was so uplifting to the people, why St. Matthew bothers mentioning all these little notes, because this is the great thing everyone was hoping for. And as Jesus says, he's come in to usher the kingdom. Now, he doesn't say the kingdom of David, he says the kingdom of heaven. And that's because he's doing something more than just bringing back the 12 tribes. He's bringing all nations into one kingdom. And this is amazing. God has not only delivered on the promise, but he has gone the full 9 yards, the whole way. He has given us all an opportunity to be a part of this kingdom. And it's a kingdom that will never end because it's a kingdom of heaven. Right? There's no population decrease in heaven. There's no war in heaven. There's no disagreement in heaven. Everyone in heaven is living for the kingdom. It only grows. So that's what Jesus is preparing everyone for. And because it is a kingdom, this is why we have the church. You ever thought about that? You know, some people sometimes talk about how you hear them argue that we don't need to go to church, going to mass or organized religion, all of that is just kind of it's a man-made institution. Jesus didn't come in the world to establish that. Jesus came in the world to preach peace and love and a positive message and just wants us to love each other, We hear that, right? That's how people often look at what Jesus came to do. And yet, if you were a first century Jew and you're hearing this, you'd be like, that might be part of it, but that's not the main thrust of what's happening here. It's not just a message. Jesus didn't just come into the world to preach some kind of positive message to us. He came to reestablish the kingdom. To restore the kingdom that was lost. And so he sets the 12 apostles to reign over the 12 tribes of Israel. And what do? What's the first thing they do after Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, and Pentecost has come down upon them? They start to travel out to all the ends of the earth. And they establish churches, and they build up the faithful. They build up the kingdom. And many of these churches, all independent of each other, who had no contact. You didn't have cell phones. You didn't have you couldn't just drive in and go visit, another place way down. You couldn't fly over. It was like months travel, to go from one place to another sometimes. So they weren't in communication with each other, and yet each church established the same thing. Well, so do you think that Jesus came into the world just to preach a general message to people? Or does it look like he organized a religion? That he formed those who would be bishops over it, and he sent them out to establish the churches, to establish his kingdom all around the world? That's what Jesus came to do. And so it's through his kingdom that we hear his message, that we learn about what he taught. We come to have the framework to truly understand it as citizens, subjects of the kingdom. And so if we try to say, it doesn't matter what religion we practice, it doesn't matter what we believe, it doesn't matter if we come to church on Sunday, if we think those things don't matter, we're missing that Jesus specifically was establishing a kingdom. And we actually hear in the prophet Isaiah, if you continue that prophecy, like we heard the first little part of it in our first reading today, but the next line where it continues on, it says, and then unto us a child will be born, who will be named Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, Mighty God. Sounding familiar? Right? And he will be a light to the nations, and the government will be laid upon his shoulder, and of his kingdom there will be no end. That's the prophecy. So all of this was pointed towards who is the light that would be born? Who is the light that would enter into the world? Jesus Christ. That's what we went through celebrating on Christmas, was going through these prophecies to see how everything was fulfilled in Jesus, and that he established his kingdom for us, that the kingdom here on earth is what we call the already but not yet kingdom. Because we're right at the beginning of it. We're right at the cusp of it. We're getting a taste of it. We are living in the kingdom, and yet we are waiting for the kingdom, because it's the kingdom of heaven. And so the kingdom begins here on earth, but we prepare for the next. We prepare for the eternal kingdom, where everything comes to fulfillment. And it's there in the kingdom of heaven that Jesus, as the high priest, ascended into heaven, entered his throne to reign over all creation, and where he, as high priest, celebrates the eternal Mass. You starting to see the connection of why we have a church, why the church is the kingdom? Because it's all an image of heaven. What happens here at the altar is an image of what happens in the heavenly throne. It's an image pointing forward to what is promised to come, because here on the altar, God descends down, takes on the form of bread and wine, under the appearance of bread and wine, that he gives himself to us. We literally receive God when we come to Mass. We have him proclaimed to us. We enter into the one sacrifice of Mass that is offered by Jesus on the cross for eternity as high priest in heaven. He enters the veil and he offers the Mass for us. We enter into that mystery, and then from heaven down descends our God, that we might receive a taste already here on earth. That's the kingdom. That's the kingdom that God has established. And so that's why we want to spread the good news, why we want to bring people in, and why, I gave you this little history lesson, because we don't know. We don't know what we've got. We've lost touch. We've lost connection with what we have here. And it's so easy to just fall into the routine. It's so easy to just carry on with things without really initiating ourselves, giving ourselves over to God. Trying to see with eyes unveiled the myriad of angels present here at the altar as the sacrifice is offered, as we partake as subjects in the kingdom of heaven. So as you hear the prayers of the Mass read, you'll hear with a new ear, even when we say the Our Father, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." All these prayers, we call forth the kingdom because we are members of his kingdom. So let's enter into this moment. Enter into this beautiful sacrifice, this beautiful offering to prepare our hearts for the eternal kingdom where we will live and reign with our God forever and ever.